Let's be honest, Necromorphs are some of the most disturbing monsters in video game history. Imagine a corpse that's been reanimated, weaponized, and repurposed into a brutal killing machine, designed to hunt down and butcher the living to build an army from the dead. Necromorphs come in many different forms in Dead Space, all having their own unique features, abilities, and ways in which they can turn a person into a puddle of meat. And in this video, we're going to be taking a close look at every single Necromorph type in the game, from the very small, to the very big, to the downright bloody relentless, all of which are out to give this poor bastard the worst day of work he's ever had. When most people think of the word Necromorph, they usually always think of this delightful looking thing. Slashers are up there with some of the most iconic monsters in the entire horror game genre, mainly down to them having such a recognisable silhouette. Being the most common enemy type in the game, these guys are usually going to be causing Isaac the most problems, by diving out of vents, sneaking up from behind, and generally wasting a buttload of his ammunition. But because the one golden rule of Dead Space is to cut off the limbs, slashers don't exactly do themselves any favours, having such long, gangly arms and legs that are extremely susceptible to being lopped off. On the face of it, they might just seem like lanky buggers that run around stabbing everyone, but their whole design could actually go a bit deeper than that. Dead Space tells a very dark but very ironic story. Humans are out mining the galaxy, exploiting their power to harvest natural resources for their own selfish needs. But they wind up literally becoming natural resources themselves, harvested by another life form for its own selfish needs. Even more ironically, these slashers are the main creatures doing a lot of that harvesting, using a pair of scythe-like blades, something that ties into themes of both agriculture and death by symbolising the Grim Reaper, a guy whose job is to farm people's souls and guide them to the afterlife, which in this case comes in the form of convergence, by getting sliced to bits and reborn as a freaky flesh demon. So slashers are definitely up there as the most popular Necromorph type, but it probably wouldn't be a Dead Space game if it wasn't for the jumpy meat mermaid. Leapers are also very common things to see roaming around the USG Ishimura, though the infections definitely ramp things up a notch or two, by twisting these people into something much more animalistic. Their legs, guts, and, well, pretty much their entire lower halves of their bodies have all fused together to create a long scorpion-like tail, covered in spines and deadly barbs, while on the other end of its messed up body, the host's face has been split apart to form a four-pronged set of dagger-like fangs, sort of giving the Leaper a bit of a reptilian-looking face. While slashers are designed to be the sneaky foot soldiers, these things are built to pounce on their victims using hit-and-run tactics, being slippery buggers that can crawl around on the walls and ceilings, allowing them to strike from unexpected angles and dive around the place to reposition. They're very fast, very agile, and very well suited to those zero-G environments on the ship. So if you happen to be floating around in one, chances are at least one of these guys might be in there with you, eyeing you up as a snack. Deep space mining's a pretty dangerous job, and the workers on the ship were often prone to having nasty accidents, so much so that an entire biolab was made for creating clones of the workers, which could then be used to replace damaged organs and missing limbs. Bit of a dark and controversially unethical thing to do, but let's face it, we're dealing with a company that desecrates entire planets. Well, these worker clones all start out as infants, bobbing around in giant test tubes, which nicely solves the mystery as to why there's a bunch of monster babies crawling around a corporate mining vessel in the arse end of space. The marker certainly doesn't discriminate who or what gets infected, just so long as it's a squishy thing that can be weaponized, in some form or another. Because lurkers are so puny and lack the necessary bulk to overwhelm their victims with brute force efficiently, the infections repurpose these little wandering lumps of biomass to become ranged adversaries instead. 3 long ropey tentacles have torn their way out of the lurker's back, which are capable of launching volleys of deadly projectiles. Those same tentacles do have some pretty big spikes on the end of them though, and with the lurkers feeling a bit brave, it might just decide to rush on over and jab the living crap out of you with them up close instead. That said, these things do kinda act like the pests of the game, especially considering they also like to attach themselves to walls and ceilings too, just like the Leapers, sort of acting like biological gun turrets that pepper you with annoying darts from the other side of the room. Which nicely leads me over to another projectile-flinging monstrosity called the Spitter, a necromorph that might be easily mistaken for a standard slasher, up until the point where it starts firing out green balls of toxic danger across the room, in the form of highly acidic alien goo generated by the creature's mutated organs. With the Spitter being another ranged enemy type, you can expect this thing to stand back and do most of the damage from the safety of distance. If you stand around in one spot for too long though, you'll probably end up getting slapped in the face by a blob of corrosive phlegm. This can often be a bigger problem than it actually sounds, because along with the liquid slowly eating away at your health over time, it's also going to drastically slow down your movement speed to a crawl, giving the Spitter and all of his nearby buddies a very nice opportunity to charge on over and lash out with a bunch of melee attacks up close while you're vulnerable. Easily one of the wackiest Necromorphs you'll find flapping around on the ship is the Infector, a human torso that's been repurposed into one hell of a f***ed up looking stingray, which drags itself along the floor on a pair of fleshy wing-like appendages. These wandering meat slabs aren't exactly powerhouses on their own, but if they're suddenly let loose in a room full of dead bodies, which, let's be honest, there's plenty of those on this bloody ship, then you better be prepared for all the frantic chaos that's likely to follow. The Infector's job is to basically speed up the conversion process by directly pumping that Necromorph fluid into the corpses lying around on the floor. It does this by latching onto a body with some kind of rope-like appendage, probably some poor bugger's mutated intestine, and then ramming its huge bug-like proboscis into them while it hovers around in the air, looming over that body, as it violently mutates into an even tougher variant of the standard slasher, potentially filling the room with these things in a matter of seconds, if you don't gun the Infector down in time. Although they'll mainly rely on their freshly baked minions to do most of the work for them, you can still be jabbed by that Infector organ up close if they've finished hoovering up the place. They might be on a mission to create more savage monsters, but let's not forget the fact that they're also pretty savage monsters themselves. Despite being one of the smallest Necromorph types on the ship, Swarmers can still be one of the biggest pains in the arse. They're essentially just tiny skittering nuggets of reanimated flesh that sort of act like a bunch of very angry space leeches. Probably a bit of a nuisance to Isaac if one starts munching away in his face, but potentially a much bigger problem when a whole gang of these parasitic pests all emerge at once, which is typically always the case with Swarmers, hence the name. Isaac can get completely overwhelmed in a matter of seconds, causing his health to deplete at a surprisingly rapid rate. Gotta frantically bat them all off before they can do much harm, or you could gun them all down before they manage to latch on in the first place. Maybe give them a nice blasting with the force gun, or barbecue the living crap out of them with your good old trusty flamethrower. Never fails. Well, you better get used to seeing those Swarmers if you're not careful around our next enemy type, as the pregnant, swollen belly is cram-packed with a writhing colony of them. These fat boys might waddle around at a fairly slow pace on those stumpy little legs, but they'll compensate for this by having extra long arms with much heavier blades, hoping to extend their reach while allowing them to wreak havoc if they manage to get within striking range. Should you accidentally shoot that chonky body though, then you'll persuade the pregnant to drop to the floor and go on to saw its own stomach open, bursting the big bubble containing those Swarmers and unleashing them all into the room as a last-ditch effort to complicate the fight as much as possible. This will usually nerf the pregnant in the process by completely destroying its lower abdomen, but having that violent hellspawn scampering around the place just isn't usually worth the trade-off, making limb shots even more of a priority than usual against pregnants, amplifying the pressure to land them in hectic moments when there's loads of other Necromorphs all hunting you down at the same time, as the last thing you really need is those annoying little buggers joining in with them too. The more time you spend on the USG Ishimura, the more of this awful stuff you'll see popping up all over the place. The mining vessel's gradually being overwhelmed by living necromorph tissue known as corruption, reanimated dead cells that spread like a virus, constantly mutating and growing all over the ship's surfaces like a massive meaty plant, consuming any biomatter it finds along the way to grow itself even faster. Aside from being a living thing itself, it's also helping to create an alien biome that the necromorph creatures can thrive in, not only letting the existing ones infest the ship easier, but also creating conditions where new monsters can be formed from its structures, monsters that can be found in areas where the corruption has taken over. One pretty good example of this is by spawning pods, which can emerge from corruption-covered surfaces. Arguably one of the more disturbing enemies in the game, when you come to realise that this creature is actually some kind of deformed necromorph fetus. In a similar way to those Lurker babies, these things have also been weaponized by the infection and repurposed into ranged enemies too, due to their overall lack of strength and physical power. But because these pods consist of biomatter that's so underdeveloped, they haven't even got usable limbs to crawl around on. Not to mention the fact that their entire body is only just about capable of sustaining one barb-flinging tentacle instead of 3. That's still plenty enough firepower to give Isaac a bit of a headache though. especially when there's a bunch of them all spread out in a room, pelting him with spikes from multiple different angles. Oh dear, look what's happened to poor old Bob down on the medical deck. He seems to have turned into beef lasagna, plastered all over the walls. Well, another thing the corruption is prone to doing is turning some of the bodies it absorbs into guardians, which act as biological traps designed to slaughter anyone trying to escape through certain doorways and corridors. The process of becoming one of these deadly traps doesn't happen straight away though, and in their early stages of development, they actually start out as very weak creatures, basically just reanimated dead guys with their backs fused to the walls. They will lash out with a bunch of mutated intestines if you get too close, but all that's really going to do is give Isaac a little bit of a tickle. But these very same intestines will eventually become a lot more dangerous when a Guardian reaches full maturity, ultimately becoming one of these nasty things. A sludgy mass of flesh and muscle, and a very effective stationary defense mechanism for the corruption to exploit. Because those intestine tentacles are now strong enough to knock your head off, wandering up to a Guardian at this stage would be a very dumb idea. But because it's directly merged into the corruption itself, the monster now acts as a direct exit point for all those pesky pods, allowing the thing to essentially give birth to them by plopping pods out all over the room, giving you a lot more to think about than just the Guardian itself. Despite the tentacles being the creature's biggest strength, they're also its biggest weakness too, as chopping them all off will kill the Guardian, causing it to burst into a shower of gooey sludge. Lovely. Fire also works pretty well here too, and at the end of the day these morbid looking things probably do look like the kind of monster that you'd want to blast in the face with a flamethrower anyway. Unlike a lot of necromorphs, which have typically been formed from one human body, the Brute is a good example of what can happen if a load of different bodies all merge together to form an individual creature with greater strength and power. Having a name like the Brute, it's probably no surprise that these things are a bit on the brawny side, with all that combined muscle and bone matter being compressed and hardened to essentially create thick plates of calcified armor covering the entire front of its bulky body. That pretty much throws conventional limb shots out of the window, as these angry piles of beef can just shrug off most weapon fire like they're getting hit by nerve pellets. And aside from storming around the room like a pissed off space gorilla, Brutes are also gifted with a special ranged attack, allowing them to launch highly explosive bomb clusters from their massive podgy bellies. All that said though, they're definitely not quite as menacing once you know how to handle them, basically by running around the back and taking aim at those squishy orange blisters. And with a little help from stasis, you can put these boisterous buggers down in barely any time at all. Some of the necromorph types we've seen so far have their own stronger subbreeds, enhanced variants with extra power and damage resistance, which sort of look like they've crawled out of a bloody swamp. We've already met the enhanced slashers earlier on in the video, the ones cooked up by the Infectors. But along with those guys, we've also got enhanced leapers, lurkers, brutes, and even a few pregnants thrown into the mix too. And if you pop their stomachs, well, you can expect lurkers to come flying out of them instead of a legion of swarmers. All of these enhanced variants have a somewhat similar kind of appearance to the basic ones, though you can clearly tell them apart because of their mouldy looking rotting skin, extra spiky bones protruding from their bodies, and of course the elephant in the room, those bright glowing eyes that beam straight into your soul. They can definitely amp up the tension in certain situations, because that extra durability makes them tougher to dismember, which often gives them better opportunities to get up close and remove a few limbs themselves. We can see a lot of these guys in the later chapters, maybe down to the infection having a longer time to develop in their systems. But so long as Isaac's upgrading his weapons along the way, their extra numbers shouldn't be too much of a big deal. Swarmers aren't the only thing you'll find crawling along the blood-soaked floors of the Ishimura, because some of the crew's ripped-off body parts have also become modified by the infection too, now functioning as independent creatures. The marker might be a bit diabolical, but it's certainly not inefficient. Disembodied heads, known as creepers, have managed to sprout some tendrils, letting them wriggle around on the deck in search for a new neck hole to dive into, usually accompanied by a gang of chopped off mutant appendages that sort of look like fleshy spiders that scurry around wildly on the floor. None of these creatures are particularly strong, being so small and not really having enough mass to cause much physical harm on their own, but they do at least act as a nice distraction for the much slower creeper, which is fully intending to dive on Isaac's shoulders to give his neck a very problematic cuddle. It wants to take over his body, and it plans to do that by ripping his head off and replacing it by itself. But just like the swarmers from before, the force gun and flamethrower can be pretty handy things to have in your inventory whenever a bunch of these things decide to make a random appearance, being weapons well suited to taking down multiple fast-moving enemies all in one go. One of the more creative ways in which a Necromorph might try and kill you is by taking away the very thing that's actually keeping you alive. Oxygen in the middle of space is a very precious commodity that shouldn't be taken for granted, and the Necromorph threat is smart enough to know this. It's why it's developed a bunch of Wheezers to sabotage arguably the most important sector on the entire ship, the hydroponics deck, which basically acts as a critical life support system by providing crew members with the food, water, and breathable air needed to survive and sustain themselves in the deep dark void of space. The Wheezer is probably one of the most miserable looking Necromorph forms of the lot. Its whole body has been repurposed into a poison gas generator, the creature's lungs have blown up to a massive size and burst out of its back, all while it's glued to the floor unable to move or do practically anything else aside from cough out clouds of nasty fumes. And just to top it all off, it also looks like a giant scrotum. So you'll want to put these gloomy looking things out of their misery by jabbing them in the head with a special enzyme, clearing the room of harmful gases, thus preventing Isaac from being suffocated to death. The Exploder might be one of the puniest Necromorphs you'll encounter, but it's certainly capable of making a bloody big mess, as being attached to a glowy bag of highly volatile gunk gives it enough power to make it one of the deadliest things on the entire ship. This creature's legs have been fused together to create a thick, muscular appendage used for hopping around on, while its right arm is extended to act as, well, basically a new leg. Which might look a bit weird with it now acting like a clumsy, fleshy tripod, but this new biological design helps to give the Necromorph better balance, as it staggers around the place wielding the awkward lump of deadly bile. Exploders are born to sacrifice themselves for the Necromorph cause, and it's kinda obvious how they're gonna try and do that. Let them get too close, bad things are going to happen, which forces you to wipe these guys out before they get a chance to slam you over the head. The blast radius is pretty wide and can damage anything in the vicinity, and although shooting the orange sack is generally a good enough way to kill these things, along with any other Necromorph nearby, you could always sever it instead and turn that explosive into a throwable projectile, something Isaac's kinesis device can utilize very effectively. Sometimes while you're wandering around the claustrophobic corridors of the USG Ishimura, you might just get randomly grabbed by one of these gnarly things. I suppose the tentacles in Dead Space are one of the more mysterious enemies of the game, because we don't really know whether they belong to a bigger creature, or whether they actually exist as an individual being. But one thing we do know is that they've been punching massive holes through the ship's interiors and laying waste to anything that stands in their way. These tentacles are extremely powerful, being comprised of bone and muscle tissue, all compacted together using quite a lot of different people by the looks of it. Some being specifically designed to latch onto humans and drag them back to their lair within the walls. And once they get yanked into one of these grisly hellholes, they're definitely not coming back out. Not in one piece anyway. But they do have a stupidly obvious weak spot in the form of that big orange blister plopped right in the middle of its body, giving Isaac a nice bulgy target to shred up with his guns. But some of the tentacles can also emerge from dark shadowy pits below, and these variants are designed to play whack-a-mole with Isaac's head. If you get too close to them, then you'll probably end up getting smashed into paste. But fortunately, they've also got the very same weak spots as their grabby counterparts, making them pretty easy things to deal with, providing they don't catch you off guard. Well, what in the great pit of Carcoon do we have here? It turns out that some of the tentacles you encounter are going to be attached to another Necromorph, and a really bloody big one at that. A 10,000-ton beast of a monster known as the Leviathan managed to force its way on board and into the food storage bay, only to gobble up everything in there. This thing was responsible for speeding up the corruption growth on the hydroponics deck, which led to some of the crew members getting morphed into those toxic spewing Wheezers. And because those things were directly linked to the Leviathan, jabbing them with that special enzyme actually helped to weaken the big beastie too. Doing that put Isaac in a good enough position to take on the Leviathan himself. Still not exactly a great position, because he's essentially having a fight with a giant wall of raging ham. The food storage room happens to be a zero-G environment, which at least allows him to float around the place, while trying his best not to get his head knocked off by a writhing tentacle. Though in typical tentacle fashion, they're also cursed with those explosive bubbly blisters, which Isaac can destroy whenever one flies out to try and punch him in the face. Of course, the more you do that, then the more you'll piss the monster off, eventually persuading it to take the fight a bit more seriously, rather than just acting like it's trying to bat away a pesky fly. It'll do this by spitting out organic bombs, which come floating out of that gaping mouth in the middle, which can either be dodged or thrown back at the Leviathan to do considerable damage, with that mouth now acting as a new weak spot. In one last-ditch effort to try and take Isaac down, the Leviathan's going to let out one hell of a nasty fart, expelling all of its gas reserves and basically apply a lot more pressure to get the fight done and dusted quickly. After sustaining enough damage though, it's going to get sucked out of an airlock and cast into space, allowing Isaac to breathe a heavy sigh of relief. In this case, quite literally. But the big meaty bastard comes back for round 2 a little bit later on in the game, choosing to latch onto the communication antenna just when we're about to bloody use it. By now we kinda know how this thing likes to attack, but obviously we've been thrown into a completely different scenario with it. And because this fight takes place on the outside of the ship, Isaac's gonna need to keep topping up his oxygen levels using the air canisters dotted along the walls. The Leviathan Remnant's weak spots are also protected by a layer of hardened skin, making it slightly trickier to wound this time, forcing you to use the ADS cannons placed around the catwalk to manually blast your way through to reveal the gooey core underneath, which you'll need to destroy too, of course. But while you're floating around in the vacuum popping the monster's pimples, you're also going to need to avoid everything it throws at you too, whether that be its thrashing tentacles or those biological bombs that it likes to spit out before. But if that wasn't enough danger for you, then wait for it to start littering the arena with these floating mine things, giving you yet another obstacle to avoid, all while trying to remember that Isaac can't bloody breathe. After destroying all the weak spots though, the Leviathan Remnant's going to peel itself off the antenna, like that big scab that you probably shouldn't have picked off your elbow that time, and then drift off into space, never to be seen by us again. Well, because we're running around an industrial mining vessel, it kinda makes sense for a lot of the workers on here to be suited up with the appropriate gear. Some specialized units were given their own heavily armored rig suits to help give them extra protection in potentially dangerous situations. Of course, they were thrown headfirst into a very dangerous situation, and against a Necromorph outbreak, that fancy rig suit was probably about as useful as a pair of tits on a goldfish, as the miners, engineers, and security personnel wearing them on board were all murdered by the creatures, with many of them becoming slashers themselves, donning the very same suits they died in. That extra padding makes them slightly trickier to take on, forcing Isaac to be a bit more mindful where he aims, as the good old blow the legs off to slow them down trick has now gone pretty much out the window, due to their legs and bodies being covered by that armoured plating. They've still got their arms and heads poking out though, so it makes good sense to aim at those instead. And because you can't slow the movements down with leg shots anymore, slapping them in the face with some stasis will probably be your best alternative here, if you're struggling to target their exposed limbs. The officers on the ship might have had a high stature before they were killed. Oh well, you could definitely say that they kept that high stature after their bodies became infected. Some of them were transformed into these lanky beasts, known as Dividers. Arguably one of the creepiest Necromorphs in the game, down to them being so freakishly tall, with their body parts stretched out, all connected by fleshy vines of twisting biomatter. Their extended legs allow for longer strides, all the better for closing the gap quickly, and their massive claw hands act as very deadly weapons, all the better for bitch-slapping Isaac around the room. But the Dividers actually have a very special party trick, as their chopped off limbs will act as separate creatures, able to move around and attack independently. Remember the creepers and components from earlier on in the video? Well, that gangly thing that you just wiped out was actually comprised of those little pests, all working together in a unified form to gain more strength and power. With the Divider disassembled, you've now got to deal with all its wandering body parts, and we can't be having those nasty things scrambling around the place biting your ankles, so you're best wiping them all out as quickly as you can before they manage to finish the fight that was started by the Divider. After a warship called the USM Valor collided into the side of the Ishimura, Isaac hopped on board the wreckage to find its singularity core. But his arrival would be welcomed like a wet fart on a hot date, because a Necromorph infestation wiped out most of the crew and repurposed their bodies into something brutally volatile. Because the Marines on the ship were wearing advanced rigs when they died, the Marker's infection mutated them in a bit of a funky way, using the stasis modules with their own flesh and nervous systems, which was kicked into reverse to feed these guys a continuous supply of unstable energy, basically making them act like Necromorph crackheads. These aptly named Twitchers are essentially hyperspeed slashers that zip around the place going a bit berserk. They've got very jerky movements, making them a lot harder to track with weapons, and if they suddenly burst into the room that you're in, then you're going to need to think fast and act accordingly. Unfortunately, your stasis module is going to do jack shit against these guys, unless you're using the prototype version that is. But there is a saving grace here in the form of the Twitch's own stasis module, buried into its chest. And destroying that's going to release a pulse of energy, temporarily slowing everything down within a localized field, giving Isaac a few seconds afterwards to do what he does best. If you're finding it tricky to actually do that, because of all the constant glitching, then you might want to whip out the force gun to activate easy mode. Yeah, Twitchers absolutely hate that thing. Okay, it's time to get a bit more serious, because our next Necromorph is easily one of the most pissed off and quite frankly terrifying stalker enemies that ever did stalk. Without going too deep into the Dead Space lore, there's a fanatical religion in the game called Unitology that actually worships the Necromorph cause. Quite a lot of the people on board the Ishimura followed this religion before they got turned into paste, including a deranged scientist called Dr. Mercer, who studied the effects of the Marker's influence and grew a radical obsession with the Necromorph infection. Mercer conducted a bunch of sadistic experiments on the ship's crew, along with a very unfortunate dude called Bran Harris, who was subjected to a bunch of horrible surgeries, and even got necromorph tissue directly jabbed into his brain, which all led to him getting violently mutated into this brutal abomination called the Hunter, Dr. Mercer's new biologically engineered pet, designed to harvest the human species with maximum efficiency. This creature's a lot chunkier, meatier, and more menacing than a typical slasher, having far bigger blades and a face that would make an onion cry. But the main thing that separates this gnarly bastard from all the other gnarly bastards is the fact that the Hunter's got those dreaded regeneration abilities, which is enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone who likes to play horror games. Slice off a limb? Well, it's gonna grow back not long after, and even if you completely pulverize this guy and turn him into a mushy pile of gloop on the floor, it's not gonna be very long until he's back on his feet stomping along again. Of course, chopping off those limbs can be a good idea to either slow him down or literally disarm him momentarily, but most of the time you just need to simply survive the Hunter's encounters, eventually luring him into specific traps on the ship to either freeze or disintegrate him, which is pretty much the only way to get rid of this guy. After finally escaping the nightmarish hellscape that is the USG Ishimura, Isaac's tossed back into another nightmarish hellscape on the surface of Aegis 7, out of the frying pan and into the fire. This is the place where the red marker was found before it was extracted by the ship, and it also happens to be the home of a gargantuan necromorph worm creature living at the bottom of a massive crater. Enter the Hive Mind, a nexus organism with the power to strengthen the marker's signals and relay commands to other creatures within its telepathic range, sort of like the necromorph equivalent to a Wi-Fi extender. It laid waste to an entire colony of people here that set up an illegal mining outpost, so it's sure as hell gonna try and snuff out this tiny little engineered dude who keeps taking pot shots at its dangly bits. Being covered in writhing tentacles, the Hive Mind's got plenty of things to flatten you with as you go about your business bursting the orange flesh balloons dotted around its mouth. This boss fight's another case of, if it glows, it needs to be popped, all while dodging the many projectiles being spat out, while taking care of the smaller necromorph minions being summoned to the arena too. And let's not forget about the fact that it likes to bathe you in acidic sludge, limiting the amount of space you've got with those puddles being left on the floor. But gunning down all the weak spots will eventually convince the Hive Mind to pick you up, forcing you to shoot the big guy in the mouth to prevent being thrown down its gullet, which should be enough to finally kill the monster for good, and cause its carcass to go rolling back down to the bottom of the crater, from whence it came. So you might have killed the big tentacle slug at the end of the story, but there's still plenty of other savage beasts waiting to rip you apart in New Game Plus. These come in the form of the Phantom Necromorphs, much more resilient, hardcore variants, which are basically the next step up from those grotty looking enhanced ones. There are 4 different types of Phantom Necromorph, all pretty much having the same sort of demonic characteristics. We've got slashers, leapers, lurkers, and of course, some badass looking brutes, all mixed into the general necromorph population on the ship to throw curveballs at you unexpectedly. They're not just going to do that by looking a bit scarier though, as they'll complicate fights by soaking up a hell of a lot more damage. It's going to take more shots to slice off their limbs, and they're going to be able to keep going on with even less of them attached too. Let's just say that these necromorphs are definitely on a mission. It almost seems like they're taking things personally. If you see those red glowing eyes peering at you through the darkness, then you better be prepared to lose a crap ton of ammunition. The Phantoms definitely aren't going to go down without a fight. Well, if you want to see more gruesome monsters that also like to push the boundaries of body horror, then you'll probably want to check out my entire guide on Chronos the New Dawn. The link for that video should be up on the screen now. Or if you want to take a browse through all of my horror game monster guides, then you should click on the playlist just underneath it, covering Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and everything else in between.